I work as a software architect at World, and today I'd like to talk to you about how you can use automation to migrate TYPO3 CMS extensions to TYPO3 Flow and by extension to TYPO3 Neos. This is a side project that I've been working on and that I have taken some interest in, that I have been working on for quite some time, and I've also talked about it, for example, at the TYPO3 conference earlier. And today I'd like to focus on in-depth technical details of how these automated migration workflows, how they actually work. And before diving too deep into that, I'd like to talk a little bit about legacy applications, because that's in the talk title, legacy applications. And I bet each and every one of us has one or two of these skeletons in our closet. You remember these type of applications that were built some time far back at the dawn of time against God knows which requirements, and somehow these applications have managed to persist up until the present day, and now you have some kind of unmaintainable mess that is really very complex. That's actually a sculpture that stands somewhere in Switzerland. And applications like these that grow organically over time, they get very difficult to maintain. So even when you have minor changes that are to be added to be performed on applications like these, it gets very inefficient. And when I'm tasked with changing an application like these, I'm always feeling like you know this game Mikado, where your objective is to remove these single sticks, and you don't get points if one of the other sticks moves. So that's how I often feel when changing one of these applications. So we need a new form input field. Okay. Don't move. All right. Work. So there's always a risk when working with these kinds of applications, and it's usually quite dangerous. You can mitigate this, for example, by introducing acceptance tests or stuff like that. But still, there's a risk in maintaining these overly complex and historically grown applications. Is this feeling familiar to any of you? Please raise your hand if you know that feeling. Yeah. Feels good to not be alone, doesn't it? And of course, we also have these. That is a universal problem. So we also have these ancient Molochs also in the TYPO3 world, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. So my use case for this might be a bit of an edge case, because TYPO3 CMS is not typically used as an application development framework, but you can do so. And in the past, it was often used as an application development framework, although there are definitely better tools for the job. But let's look, for instance, at TYPO3 sites that contain custom extensions with a heavy amount of business logic in them. These are sites in which you probably do not need a lot of the CMS functionality of TYPO3, but probably use TYPO3 more as a framework. And I'm going to focus on how you can migrate these TYPO3 extensions with a heavy amount of business logic to a newer platform, like, for example, TYPO3 Flow. So, what do I do when I see one of these legacy applications with heavy business logic? Well, that may be personal for me, but I really like to build stuff. I always did. So the first and intuitive and maybe naive solution that comes to mind is just rewrite that application from scratch. Tear it down, build it from anew. That may be a viable option for many cases. But when you have applications that have, for example, maybe have grown over decades, have millions of lines of code, it's not really a trivial task to rewrite an application like this from scratch. Actually, I read that once somewhere in literature, I don't remember the author, he wrote that when in re-engineering projects, you have clearly defined requirements because the legacy software actually works as a requirement definition. That sounds well in theory. Hey developer, you don't need any user stories, just read the source code and redesign it from scratch. No problem, isn't it? Yeah. So, not in theory, fine, in practice, probably not. So, in some cases, it might not be an option to completely rebuild an entire application from scratch. Maybe because of constraints of resources, time, money. Maybe you don't even know the full requirements that the application would have to fulfill if you rebuild it. So in some cases, it might also be a viable alternative not to rebuild this application from scratch, not to do complete re-engineering, but to migrate the existing code that you already have onto a new platform. With the motivation that maybe your code will be better maintainable when moving to a new platform. So when talking about TYPO3 applications, a natural migration target that would come to mind is of course TYPO3 Flow. And when talking about Flow, we of course also talk by extension about Neos, because it's basically not that big a thing to use a Flow package also as a Neos plugin. So when talking about migrating from CMS to Flow, there's actually a backdoor that we can use. Because if you may remember, migration from CMS to Flow was actually exactly what XSpace was supposed to be doing. So, in theory, it should be relatively easy to migrate XSpace extensions to CMS. And fun fact, over the time I've learned to, when a sentence starts with, in theory, it should be easy to blah blah, I often ignore that because it's bullshit. So in theory, it should be easy, but it mostly isn't really. Nevertheless, XSpace was designed to provide compatibility to TYPO3 Flow, and in large parts it actually does. So migration of XSpace extensions is the first thing that we should look at. Of course, we have other APIs in TYPO3 CMS. We also have these old PI-based extensions, and for a time there were many third-party frameworks that you could use. I remember something like the diff 2000 somewhat extension, which delivered a custom MVC stack, I believe. So maybe there are still some of those around. Migrating XSpace extension is relatively straightforward. I'll get to that in a moment. PI-based extension gets a little more complicated, and third-party frameworks are, for me, at the moment, out of scope. But maybe if we'll get the time, we'll talk a little bit about migrating, if and with on which way it is possible to bring PI-based TYPO3 extensions into the flow. So now I've talked a lot about migrating from CMS to Flow, and I will continue to do so later on. But before continuing, allow me a little bit to talk about when not to migrate from CMS to Flow. Because there are actually cases in which it will not make sense to try to convert a TYPO3 CMS extension to TYPO3 Flow. So imagine a TYPO3 extension that does not really contain any kind of business logic, but extends the CMS functionality of CMS. Maybe adds a new content element or whatnot. So it would not really make sense to convert an extension like that to Flow. Not to Flow because Flow doesn't have any CMS functionalities, but you could think about migrating it to Neos. But even the CMS part of TYPO3 and Neos work very differently. So it's basically apples and oranges that we're talking about here. So in my opinion, it would not make sense to migrate an extension that adds a custom content type. You shouldn't even try to migrate that to Neos. In that case, it would be easier to simply define a custom node type, write some TypoScript, and rewrite that thing from a new. Another case are extensions that rely heavily on TYPO3 APIs that are not available in Flow. So maybe, for example, an extension that integrates the custom authentication handler into TYPO3. Don't migrate that to Flow, rewrite it. Something like a user management tool shouldn't be migrated to Flow because that also works very differently in Flow. But what we can talk about are applications that are self-contained, do not depend too much on TYPO3 APIs, and contain real business logic and do not extend the CMS functionality that we do not have in Flow and that works very differently in Neos. So, all right, that being said, let's have a look at a little bit of code. What we see here is a very, very simple domain entity class that we can use in XBase. So we have a class called car with two simple properties, license number and manufacturer. And on the right side, we see how the same entity class would look like in TYPO3 Flow. And as you can see, the programming concepts are actually quite similar. And we also can infer from these two pieces of code what we actually have to do to migrate a class like the one on the left side to its TYPO3 Flow equivalent. So if you're unlucky, you're still using these PHP 5.2 style pseudo namespace class names, which you're going to have to break up. So in TYPO3 Flow, our class will only be named car and be in an appropriate namespace. And as you can see, XBase uses inheritance to denote domain entities and domain value objects. And this is done differently in Flow. As you can see, the car class in Flow doesn't inherit from anything. Doctrine takes care of persistence. But what we need instead is an annotation that denotes this class as a domain entity or domain value object. The properties we can simply take over. As you can see, both XBase and Flow configure validation through annotations, and the syntax is maybe a little bit different, but the basic principles actually stay the same. And the same goes for association attributes like our manufacturer here, for example. What we have to do in Flow additionally is to configure the cardinality of associations like this. In TYPO3 we do this using the table configuration array, which actually configures the backend forms for the TYPO3 backend, but XBase also infers a lot of its ORM configuration from this data. We don't have that in Flow. In Flow, we configure all this using these doctrine annotations. So now we have the task of, or let's imagine that we have the task of migrating a CMS site with quite a lot of extensions to Flow. So the naive approach would be to simply manually migrate one extension after the other, just like we've seen in the slide before. But this approach is, in my opinion, very, very impractical. One risk is that while you're in the process of actually performing this migration project, your target application doesn't really bring a lot of value because it's still unusable, and it's really difficult to achieve something like a minimum viable product for this, because you can't go into production with a TYPO3 flow application that was only halfway migrated from CMS. So that doesn't make any sense. So there's a lot of risk in this. You bind a lot of resources without bringing immediate value. You also have to consider that if this migration project takes on over a longer amount of time, that you maybe also have to consider double maintenance. If the source application changes, you also have to consider this in the parts of the application that already have been migrated. And what you also need to consider is something that I've often seen in legacy applications that grew organically, are that you often have dependencies between these packages that are very difficult to resolve. That's a very bad architectural code smell, but nevertheless, sometimes you have that. So you then don't even have the possibility to say, oh, let's migrate one extension after the other, and we'll build the application in iterations and add new features that were already there before, but that's not so easily possible. So what I've thought about is whether this process can be automated. And it is actually possible to automate this process, at least to a certain extent. I've talked a little bit about that already at the TYPO3 conference, so I'm not going to get too much into detail on that. I've built a little piece of software that actually is capable of performing at least a subset of all the code transformations that are necessary to migrate from CMS to Flow. I've called it Metamorph because I actually like the metaphor behind the name. You can install it using Composer. It's a TYPO3 Flow package. And the principle behind it is that you can migrate CMS code into the Flow instance that you are currently running. And now that I see this slide, I remember that I don't think that this second package actually exists on Packagist. I wanted to register it this morning, but I forgot. So I'll add it later today. As you can see, I've also given some thought on how to migrate PI-based extensions to Flow, but I haven't really gotten that deep into that because you need a lot of compatibility APIs, and it's really painful. So how can you actually do this? What needs to be done is that you need to actually rewrite PHP source code. That means that any tool that tries to automate this migration also needs to understand PHP source code. And actually, and luckily for me, there's a really good library for that, which you can use to pass PHP code into data structures. So what you can do is that you can take input PHP source files, and you can use the PHP parser library to parse these source files into a syntax tree. So a syntax tree is a data structure that represents the structure of the source code. And let's have a look at our example from before. So a simple class definition in source code would have the equivalent syntax tree that we see on the right here. So we do have a class node with the class name as attribute, some other class properties that we have extended. There are statement nodes inside that, and that can get arbitrarily complex, and it does. But the good thing is that this PHP parser library actually gives you a data structure that you can manipulate inside code. So what we have is we can take the syntax tree and apply transformation rules on this data structure, and then reprint the modified source code, the modified syntax tree back into source code. And you could actually, in theoretical, it would actually be possible to dump into a different output format than into PHP. So if you want to migrate from PHP to Python or into Ruby, you could actually do that too. Just kidding, who would want to do that? So, and actually, we need quite a lot of these transformation rules. And even though I wrote it myself, I don't really have an overview on what transformation rules you actually need to fully migrate an X-based extension from CMS to Flow, let alone a PI-based extension. But given enough effort, it's actually totally possible. One rule of thumb that I've encountered is that it's in most cases not possible to perform a complete migration in an automated way. But what you can do with automation tools like these is at least, I don't know, take over a lot of the groundwork required to do that. For example, renaming classes from pseudo namespaces to real namespaces, evaluate the TCA, add the doctrine annotations, switch out the typical class names that are used in X-Base and that have equivalences in Flow. All that can be automated, and you should automate this because these are the kind of repetitive tasks that if you do them manually, you'll make errors with them. So you may take an X-Base extension, copy the code to Flow, and then add the mapping annotations for doctrine manually, and maybe you forget something, and you'll take about 2 hours to find out which annotation you forgot or configured incorrectly.